part of it isn't just their success. Part of it is the fact that we've got to be able to that's why my project, even whatever happens at these elections, we'll keep fighting, because I want it for my kids. I want them to know that one day they'll be in a party, in a political system that didn't ask them to produce their passbook, quote unquote, or their feature to belong to a particular party, but rather that they could fight for ideas.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Kurtuba Convention Center.
Welcome to another edition of In Conversation. Today I'm in conversation with Mmusi Maimane.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's my great privilege. Thank you for having me.
You came to us an Islamic radio station. You're a pastor. You grew up in Soweto.
Yes.
The station has its roots in Lenasia.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
No, I certainly think that as South Africans, one of the things that binds us together is a powerful constitution that allows you to share your faith, to be able to engage with South Africans of different faiths. And certainly in building one South Africa, I always felt that regardless of the God you worship, we have a common vision in this country. We have a love for this nation and we want to see it prosper. And so coming to a radio station, regardless of its own origins, is important to speak to citizens, because regardless of what the argument might be around faith, I, at my very core, love all South Africans. And I think perhaps maybe this may be the pastoral aspect of me, or whatever the issue is, but I genuinely love Muslim South Africans, I love Christian South Africans. I really love the people of this nation, and that's why it'd be foolishness not to want to engage them.
How do politicians view faith communities? You're a pastor. You've been in the DA. You've been opposition ventures. You've been in national. You've been around. What is the view as politicians when it comes to campaigning? And for the lack of a better word, do faith-based issues even feature in South African elections, in South African election campaigning, and in the agendas and manifestos? Is this something to think about?
I think we're living in a global crisis of politicizing our morals rather than moralizing our politics. And what is happening as you import it from various parts of the world, you are finding the politics of religion, maybe in some ways, seeking to divide people on the basis of moral issues. And I think when you come down to South Africa, I often find that that becomes the leading conversations. Let's rather have a discussion about the morality of our nation. Whilst I think that those issues are important, I do think faith-based communities have a role to play in being able to do that. I think we must be wary not to, again, politicize our morals. What we ought to do is find a space where we ask for religious communities in the spirit of love and tolerance with so many, whether it be Gandhi, whether it's be Martin Luther King, for there to be the guiding spirit and principles amongst which intra-political conversations take place. But that furthermore, in a country such as ours, and I think as South Africans we should never lose track of this. South Africans may be religious but not fundamental. They don't fundamentalist in that sense. And that gives us a space whereupon with dialogue can occur amongst multiple different parts of the religious sections in our communities. In as far as campaigning is concerned, I do want to emphasize the fact that whether Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, whatever faith you may profess, in reality you are also as deeply concerned about whether the lights in this country stay on, whether a child is being educated, whether in fact you worry about the safety of your community. And that's why when you look at in a country as religious as this, in many ways religious parties don't dominate the parliamentary seats. Because I think sometimes we lose track of the fact that at being able to speak to a person of faith about their future, about the jobs, about their safety, about all of those things. And I think where religious communities can also guide is being able to put up again that lodestar that says there's something unethical about electing leaders who have no morals, who are ethically nowhere. It's something wrong about money being stolen that was designed for the poor. It doesn't matter what faith you come from. At least there must be an inherent interest and care for the needy. And that's, even in this period of a fast, one of the things I found always inspiring is the genuine interest in going out and serving the poor, even in this time. And that to me is inspiring. As a Christian, it inspires me when I look at that. And even in the midst of that, I think in that concern, we should do everything we can to deal with the issue of poverty in the country. And therefore, when you ask me the question, how do we interact politically with, I think the worst thing that can happen is for us to capture religious bodies and religious communities and almost in some ways make politics out of that. What we best need to do is to learn the best and say, how do we look after the poor collectively and deal with issues of society, because I think communities care about that.
Is Build One South Africa campaigning actively in quote-unquote traditional Muslim areas? Do you have activities there? Are you targeting those areas? And
certainly there's
what's your evaluation of Islam and the Muslim community in South Africa? Numbers, influence, potential voters? What?
As I say, you speak about communities like Lenasia, you speak about my mother shops in Lenasia a lot. so we're at the risk of being too typified. I think we must recognize that, especially amongst communities, Muslim communities, etc., it does become important that we engage and we share. We've got candidates who come from a Muslim faith background. And certainly what we've done as Build One South Africa is to say, how do we empower citizens to elect their own candidates? How do we empower citizens to be able to stand up and go, you will represent our interests? This is one of the hardest things you can do as a political party. The hardest thing you can do as a political party is to bring people together. I am confident that it's possible to bring a Muslim and a Jewish South African and a Christian South African in one party, bound together by shared values. Now, that's harder to do than just simply saying you're a Muslim party or a Christian party or this. Because as the tensions arise all over the world, the fears are always there, the worries are always there, and the hopes of one becomes the fears of another. And sometimes you feel like you've got to choose one over the next. But that's not the South African compact. The South African constitutional compact says that we're bound together by values, and those values are Ubuntu in many ways. That when I look at you, I see in many ways the image of the divine, and I see a fellow human being to which, when we work together collectively, we could say, as Robert Sobukwe, given this time, there shall only be one race, and it's the human race. So to me, it's why I want to build One South Africa, because I think what we need to be cautious of is to hark back to the ballot paper of 1994, where people go to the ballot paper to express their race, religion, or region. So when you look at the ballot there, you could see black parties, white parties, Indian parties, colored parties, religious parties, ethnic parties, Zulu nationalist parties. I think, to me, once you are there, it means we haven't matured our democracy to a point where citizens can come together out of shared interests and ideals. And however difficult that is, it's an ambition we have to fight for. And when I think about pre-1994, the struggle for freedom was fought across the lines of all faiths. To hark back to trying to be sectarian in that sense, I think is regressive, not progressive.
If any other politician sat in front of me in this interview, I would have told them they're lying. Except you. Because you joined the DA 2010 or 2013?
Just before 2010.
Just before 2010. At a time when it was very unpopular for a black person to join what was viewed and is still viewed as a white party. You received, up till today, you still receive a lot of criticism for that. What was that experience like? And how did you decide to make that decision to go? Tell me about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, it started off, I've never wanted to go into politics for the party bit, or maybe in some ways the ideological trappings that go with it. In 1994, post that, we were part of the branch of the NC in Soweto. We understood the struggle. We kind of wanted to live within that context.
But in 1994, you were 15, 14 years old.
14. So post those elections, once freedom, unbanning, all of that, heading towards post 98, etc., you were then able to be active in the community. And so that was it. The only political infrastructure we knew was either the IFP, AZAPO, PAC. Those were kind of like parties that we grew up with. So those were my politics. And then you head towards 2009. I was working as a pastor in a church, and we'd gone to a community.
So was that your full-time job, a pastor?
Yeah, it was. I mean, when I say it was full-time, I was full-time in the church. I was running an NGO and running a consultancy. So there was a lot of work I was doing. But the NGO we were running was delivering basic food services to communities, because I couldn't stand South Africans being poor. And I remember sitting outside the home of this one woman who was digging a hole in her garden. And I sort of said to her, "Mama, what are you doing?" She said to me, "I'm building my own toilet." Now, as an NGO, we can only give food, but we can't fix the sewage infrastructure. You just can't. And I decided I would join politics. And the natural instinct was to say, let me go back to the NC at the time, right? Because, we had this euphoric moment. You've won, democracy, what. Let the leaders do that. We'll do other things. But you realize that actually development, even though a lot of work had been done, was starting to stall. And you'll remember at that time, there was massive tension between President Zuma and President Mbeki. All of those issues were then bubbling up, which rendered the organization ineffective in as far as delivery aspects. And the NC at the time had really wasn't a home for progressives. It wasn't a home even at the time for people who wanted to actually fix the state. It was even then.
What angle were you looking at that time? Because many people the Umshiniwa movement managed to drum up a lot of support. Even people who were politically inactive saw within President Jacob Zuma something. So what was the angle that you looked at that time that said, this is not going to work?
I'd come from business at the time. I'd been involved in teaching. So my only angle was the next frontier for freedom mustn't be Umshinwam and rhetoric. It must be governance. And so I thought, I'm applying these skills in a consulting firm about how businesses can make more money. How do I make sure that government can do its job? How do I make sure that, and if you'll remember, even the 2011 election, around about then, one of the big issues that were occurring was the textbooks dilemma in Limpopo, when textbooks weren't being delivered, etc. I thought, this is a logistics issue more than any other thing.
Government issue.
You will never, even if you go to the Home Affairs today and someone tells you the system is down, you have to stop and go, I have an account with a few banks, but I'm amazed. I've never been to the bank and the bank told me, no, our system is down. And so I couldn't reconcile the two. So I then made a decision to say, I want to get back into government. And the ANC at the time became like gatekeepers. Government was for special people. I didn't know how special they had to be. And I felt, I'd met with all of them. I then decided I'm going to do a master's in economics. I studied, and I was looking around the political landscape. Joining the DA was a governance question for me.
Really?
I looked at their indicators. I said, okay, what are they doing at local government that will make sure that woman has a toilet? And I genuinely went in there believing the best of people. You have to do that. And sure, you might later on look back and go, maybe some of the assumptions I've made were not correct in other aspects. But I believed the best. And I wanted to make it happen. So that's why in 2011, I ran for mayor of Joburg as the candidate for the DA, because my starting point was actually to stand as a candidate for the ward that we needed to deliver the toilet for the women. And if you looked at the 2016 elections, where we were able to form a coalition government in Johannesburg that appointed Herman Mashaba, who was then mayor from 2016 to 2019, if you asked the message I would have given all the mayors of the DA in Gauteng at the time, which was Joburg and Tshwane, I said to both Solly Msimang and Herman Mashaba, you do nothing else in this country, but you provide dignity for our people, in my view, give that woman a toilet, and let's work hard to fix the economy. So that was my focus, right? And I always worked consciously towards that. And so in joining the DA and making the transition, yeah, it was tough because I had family, I had community members saying to me, I can remember even distributing T-shirts to my neighbors and them looking at me like, Info, we are ANC people here, now you're bringing us these DA shirts. But as they could see, at least my campaign, the 2014 Gauteng campaign, you'll recall we launched the manifesto of the DA in Dobsonville in 20, and therefore that to me said, over a period of time, people follow people. They look at you and they go, have you been honest in your period? Have you been able to fight for all citizens regardless? And one of the key projects I was driving even inside the DA, that the DA needed to be a party for all South Africans. And one of the saddest things I look at today is that having left, I see a harking back to minoritism and a party that represented only a few, rather than the very drive of a project that we're engaged with. So I don't regret the decision.
But it was very brave of you. It must have been very difficult.
Of course it was.
I mean, like I said, up till today on Twitter, people still refer to you in very derogatory terms and in those kind of decisions.
Yeah, and you know.
Do you regret it?
I don't. Okay. Like I said, I really don't. I learned a lot. You know, as human beings, you got to develop yourself.
Two learnings. Two of the most important learnings.
You learn how to try and separate politics from governance. You also learn the harsh lessons that says sometimes in politics, your principles don't always get rewarded on the scoreboard of the election. But if you have anything else as a politician, stick to your principles. And that teaches you a lot about leadership because that allows you to have enemies.
On enemies and leadership, and Umshiniwam, you were the poster boy, I think, for South Africa when it came to the anti-Zuma sentiment. I mean, there was a time when I think I even tweeted and I said, this guy speaks more about Zuma than the ANC. The irony is that today in World One South Africa, you have opposition as the other parties, the DA, the ANC, and Jacob Zuma in the MK.
It is the irony of it all.
Isn't it?
I always sought to do it respectfully when it came to President Zuma, but I mean, if you've ever driven into Nkandla itself, here sits this home. Almost it looks like Sun City in a sea of poverty. And President Zuma, not only, I mean, a commission of inquiry came about because I raised the issue and raised the complaint with the then public protector, Thuli Madonsela, and coupled with that, made sure that when President Zuma didn't want to come to parliament, he needed to come to parliament. So yeah, at the time, narrowly, there was a focus on President Zuma because he represented emblematically the feeling that we all had in the country. That
was that the DA strategy? Was that a strategy to say, guys, this is what we're going to do for the next 3-4 years?
I think, you know, when you're trying to help people see things going backwards, sometimes people need to put a person to it. In politics, people need to know who you are fighting for and against who. You know, And so it was then important that people needed to know that President Zuma's project wasn't in their interests.
To what extent do you see the MK-ANC reality impacting elections?
I worry about that.
And how does it impact your agenda, your constituencies?
Because like my earlier warning to say, I don't want us to go back to 94. Think about the cumulative aspect of those parties. ANC, MK, EFF I'd include into that. And then you put parties like ATM, etc. These are all parties formed as branches of the ANC, which means ideologically they could not be different. Where the danger then becomes is that those parties have particular views, have a history of corruption and patronage, and furthermore, you group them together where there isn't a vision for South Africa that empowers all South Africans. I think if you end up at the end of the election cycle with those parties constituting 66%, I think it says something about our society that we need to look at with great concern. And I think that part of it isn't just their success. Part of it is the fact that we've got to be able to that's why my project, even whatever happens at these elections, we'll keep fighting. Because I want it for my kids. I want them to know that one day they'll be in a party, in a political system that didn't ask them to produce their passbook, quote unquote, or their feature to belong to a particular party, but rather that they could fight for ideals. So to me, I do worry about the regression of the democratic project is when you hark back to ethnic mobilization rather than, in fact, the very exercise of governance. And you see it in many countries in Africa. You see it in what happens now in places like, even in Cameroon. You can see the tribalism that's starting to occur. You saw it to great danger in Kenya. You see in certain aspects in Nigeria, where you start to see that. You see it in Sudan. So South Africa can't afford that. It's a very, very dangerous ploy when you really follow its end game. And without even being too difficult about it, I think we need to look carefully at the extent of violence that's taking place in KZN as we sit here today, because it starts to give us flickering rights to another form of nationalism that's in contestation.
We're in conversation with a leader of Build One South Africa, Mmusi Maimane. We'll be back.
In Conversation With is proudly sponsored by Africa Cash and Carry, Crown Mines, and shot on location at Kurtuba Convention Center.